Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, bot builders, depending on what time it is for you in the world where you are. Welcome to the Botpress Basics weekly office hours. My name is Robert. I'll be your host for the week, as usual. If you're new here, welcome. It's good to have you. Let me run you through a little quick rundown of how I typically manage these streams, and then we'll go from there. So usually I run through some questions or common topics on the server over here on Botpress for the previous week, see what you guys have been asking questions about, then build a little, let's say, lesson based on that. Alternatively, sometimes I like to show off new features or run you through some basic tutorials. That's the goal, or that's what I begin all of these streams with. But of course, the benefit of us building together is that you can all ask questions as you have them. So please, if you've got questions about bot building or how to use a specific feature or really anything related to Botpress, you're more than welcome to go ahead and ask. Please don't worry about derailing me. Of course, being derailed is the purpose. That's what we're here to do, is to derail me and get your questions answered. So without further ado, I'll dive into what I've got planned for today's lesson. It's kind of a fun one. This is the Botpress Basics office hours, and this is a fairly basic skill that I'm hoping to teach all of you today. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. Let me just, I'll share my screen. We'll jump into the studio as usual. Today we're going to begin in the dashboard. Actually, we're not going to start in the studio today. So you might see over here in my list of installed integrations something that is not normally there. If you're used to watching these streams, if you are a veteran of our live streams, I don't normally have the webhook integration installed, but today I will be using webhooks, and so I'm going to be teaching you all about webhooks. We'll run through why would you want to use them, and then we'll talk maybe about some common use cases, and I'll show you a practical example. Eagle-eyed viewers, eagle-eyed listeners will see that I already have a Dropbox file tab open, and then that we will be using Dropbox later. So I hope that you find that useful or interesting. And so I encourage you to ask questions about webhooks if you wanted to dive into them but didn't know where to start. We'll be getting started today with those. Alrighty. So let's talk about webhooks. Of course, the first thing that you might be asking yourself is, why are we beginning in the dashboard today and not the studio? That is because in order to play with webhooks, do something with webhooks, we must install the webhook integration. You can find these on the hub, so if you just navigate over to the hub, you can install the webhook integration directly from this hub, but of course I've already done that. And so our last step before diving into the studio is going to be using the webhook integration, enabling it, and maybe making a note of this URL. I won't install a secret for now, but I will make a note of this URL. I'm going to copy it later, so I'm going to be saving it here. So that's what we need here. That's all the setup we need to do for today's task. And then otherwise, we can dive directly into the studio over here. So let's jump into the studio and see what we can get started. I've already started building this today, so I think what I'm going to do is I'll run you through the steps for testing and understanding what's going on. I see a question in chat. Can you explain why my bot is displaying results in the console rather than the text card where I specified the result should be displayed? Richard, I wonder how did you set up your configuration? This sounds like a really good question where you might find it helpful to post in the help channel, perhaps with actually almost certainly with some photos of the way that you set up your bot, where you've told your bot to display those results. If you've already posted that in help with a setup, someone from the community or perhaps myself will get to it eventually. You can also give me a ping. That would be helpful too. All right, let's talk about webhooks. A couple of weeks ago, maybe veterans of the live stream, or if you've watched our YouTube videos, by the way, if you're watching this on YouTube, come join us on Discord sometime. We have a great time. If you're a veteran of our live streams, you may have remembered a couple of weeks back, I did a really basic intro to making API calls in the Botpress Studio. The example that I showed off there was using an API just to grab a time zone based on some user input. So maybe the time in a specific city that you might find helpful to modulate a greeting. So you're always saying something contextual like good morning or good evening, depending on where the user is coming in from. So we used the execute code card to make those API calls, and that's useful. And now I want to get you a similarly useful skill, which is webhooks. So you can think of a webhook kind of like the opposite of an API call. So instead of making a request to a service, information is being sent in a capacity, and then your bot will respond based on something that's happened. That's a really watered down version of what a webhook is, but I think the best way to learn this is in practical terms. Let's see how a bot behaves when we're using a webhook to do something. So very helpfully, I set this up earlier in my day, but I thought it might benefit you all to see me set it up live. So I think what I'm going to do is I've used the comment functionality on Botpress, and I just popped some comments in just to help me remember how I set up this kind of example. So this very first node that's going to be connected to my start node, I'll just call this welcome. And as usual, that's kind of the first node that I'll be welcoming my user with. And let's talk about what I've set up here. So I've sent a simple text card where I'm writing, hello, your conversation ID is, and then it will print some variable in the web chat. I'll probably provide one caveat here. The end result of what I'm trying to do today is if an action is taken on an external service or another place that is not Botpress, I want my bot to behave accordingly. So in other words, I'll be triggering my bot based on an action taken elsewhere. There are lots of ways to do that. And typically we expect that to be done behind the scenes, but I want to be able to show you all of this. So I've added an extra layer of complexity. By the way, if you're familiar with our Thursday live streams, our wonderful host Patrick kind of walked me through how to set up this example. So I won't take full credit for it, but if you know Patrick, he streams on Thursday mornings. You'll find him there. But in any case, so why am I doing this? Why do I need this conversation ID? It's an important variable that will pass through to the thing that is going to be making the post request to our webhook in a second. So if we have the conversation ID, it will make our work easier to kind of follow along with. So all that is said, first thing that happens in my bot's conversation so far is I will be sending my conversation ID. I'll be printing it to the log, or I'll be sending it in a text card. So my person chatting with the bot, in this case myself, will have access to the conversation ID. Otherwise I wouldn't. Now, the next thing we need to do is set up a trigger. The trigger this is kind of like the meat and potatoes here. So the trigger here is I want to trigger a webhook event so that my bot will take an action when something has happened. In other words, a trigger is just a fancy way of saying, hey bot, take action when this happens. And of course, the action that's triggering your bot to do something is something that you specify. So I'm going to go ahead, I'll create a new trigger. Because my webhook event or my webhook integration is already installed, you'll see the webhook event here, and that'll take you into this node. And so we can see here, this is the trigger configuration for this menu. Now, what do I want to happen? I want my bot to pay attention when a webhook event has been received, do something. In other words, when the webhook event is received, I'll just move my user down to this node here. One quick thing we need to set up here is just in advanced options, we need to pass the conversation ID. In other words, my bot wants to know which conversation is happening. Otherwise, I'll do this to all of them. And so that's why we had that step earlier, and I'll just pop it over here as well. If you're interested in kind of the setup that I'm using for this, you can copy this directly from the video if you want to zoom in. If you're having trouble seeing or whatever, just shoot me a message on Discord and I'll be happy to share this setup with you. If you want like a bot export or something, I'm happy to do that as well. It's probably worth mentioning right off the top here that all of these features are free. I want to say that because in examining how I wanted to set this up and show all of you, a lot of services out there that make webhook requests actually treat webhook as a premium feature, which is, that's how it is. But I want to make it very clear you don't need to do everything that I'm showing you today. Is completely free. You don't have to pay anything for this. So if you want to test out some webhooks, you can do that. The external services I can't comment on, but on the Botpress side of things, our webhook event is not gated by a paywall currently. Okay, so that's that. So we have our trigger here. That's on. Everything is working great, hopefully. And then let's talk over here. So this is going to be my node that I'll call take action. In this case, all I want my bot to do is send a message saying that, hey, I've received your webhook or something has happened. I know that something has happened so that I, watching the bot, can understand and verify that it's working as expected. So in this comment here, I just saved a little message called your webhook has been received. And I'll just paste that over here. So now what's going to happen is once the webhook is triggered, my bot sees that something has happened elsewhere. It'll send this message. And then, of course, one thing I need to pop here is probably the preferred way or kind of like the the superstar way, or the rock star way of doing this would be to use the log card. If you all remember, this is a functionality card or utility card we introduced a couple of weeks ago to help you debug your bots without having to send a text card at every turn. I still like doing that, but if you're somebody that likes using your logs, or you are a log aficionado, I would just pop this card over here, send it here, and in other words, this won't send a message. So in other words, the payload won't be sent to your conversation, but they will show up in your logs. So to repeat that in maybe more practical terms, every time your bot triggers this webhook, this log will get printed to, this line will get printed to your logs. So I'll just call this here webhook received, and I'll show you an example of what this looks like later. So when this is finished, we'll pop back into the dashboard and we'll see this kind of log card in action. You might be wondering what level I've chosen for this. I've chosen info. This is strictly for your benefit, for your organization. So you can understand if you're printing a bunch of tests, but most of them are not important, you can just treat them as info and not errors, and not freak out every time you see something being printed to your logs. Okay, let's recap what we've done so far before we dive into our external tools that we'll be using to test this. So the first thing we did was we printed our conversation ID, which is a secret tool that will help us later. Once that's done, once we have our conversation ID in hand, we'll take an action in an external service that will trigger our webhook, and then these two things will happen. Our bot will tell us that our webhook has been received, and it will print that same message to our log, which we can check out later in the dashboard. So once all that's done, once our setup is finished, why don't we go ahead and hit publish, and then we'll dive in. We'll see how this works. While this is publishing, I want to talk about the two services I'll be using today in order to test this. In a real world scenario, what you would be expecting to happen is perhaps the tool that you're using that you want to be aware of things being done in supports making calls to webhooks. So like every time, maybe a user makes a purchase from you, Stripe can send a request to your webhook, etc. In other words, that's what we want to happen. I'm going to simulate that today by using two services. The first is going to be called Postman. This is a great way to simulate making API requests or API calls. It's really simply through the browser. It's a free service as well. Then I'll be using another service later on to simulate this with Dropbox, but for that I'll be using a service called If This Then That. It's a bit like make.com or Zapier, but I find that If This Then That is dead simple to use, and so it's probably the best way for me to introduce this to all of you. Without further ado, let's hop into Postman, talk really quickly about what's happening, and then move forward from there. So this is the Postman UI. I'm going to be I will be talking to this UI in order to make that request. A lot of this you can ignore. It can be a bit overwhelming at first, particularly if you're a beginner or you're not used to seeing this, but I promise you it's actually quite simple to use, and it's an integral part of my workflow these days because I have to test a lot of APIs that Botpress exposes. Perhaps helpful to mention here, one of Botpress's key differentiators, selling points, values is our really extensible API. So if there's things that you want Botpress to do and you're like, damn, I wish it did that, chances are you can probably just use either an integration you build yourself or an API to do it as well. Okay, so there are two main things that we want here. The first is we're making a post request. If you're curious about what the different types of methods or requests are, ChatGPT will give you a wonderful example of all of them, which is how I learned, but we're just posting information. The next is you'll see this URL here. If you remember from the beginning of the live stream, I'm going to navigate back to our dashboard. The webhook integration exposes a URL. This is what I need. So I need this URL as my endpoint here, and I've already pasted it. So when I hit send, Postman, the service, will send information to my bot. Fantastic. What the heck is it going to send? Well, let's find out. Over here, I'm just going to go to body. So this is the body of what's being sent to my bot. I'm going to type in raw, and I'm just going to confirm by hand my conversation ID. What the heck do I mean by that? Let's take a look. So I'll hit share, and we'll dive into my bot over here. We're testing webhooks together. I'll say hi. And remember, I'm expecting a conversation ID. So of course, I get my conversation ID. I'll copy it, and I'll paste it here. This is just a small bit of code telling my bot, your conversation ID is this. So when I'm making a request, Postman is going to send it to the correct conversation and not all the conversations my bot is having. Okay, So I'm going to hit send. What I expect to happen is my bot is going to confirm that I've received the webhook and then is going to save that, both send a message and then save it to the logs. But let's try it. Let's see if we've set this up correctly. So I'll hit send. The request is being sent. Bum, bum, bum. And of course, we see your webhook has been received. So in other words, I want the interesting thing, or probably the big takeaway from what just happened, is that I took an action in an external service, in a third-party service that is not related to Botpress, and my bot has recognized that that's happened. I'll repeat that because that's really the operative point that I want you all to take away from today's stream, is that I took an action in a third-party service, and then my bot was able to recognize that that happened, despite the fact that, of course, that my bot wasn't looking, it wasn't watching what I was doing. It's just that webhook. So if you're new to webhooks and it's something that you've never used before or you're not familiar with, it's a great way to conceptualize what they are and how they might be useful. For example, if you wanted your bot to send a message every time something happens, so every time a user makes a purchase from you, let's say, your bot will be listening for that, and it can trigger an action on its own. It can send a message, so on and so forth. So that's what this is. So we used a couple of services to simulate that happening, but really the big takeaway for bot building in this instance is webhooks are a great, like the dead simplest way for your bot to pay attention to things that are happening in third-party services. It's really important in the bot building world for bots that are integral part of businesses to be able to integrate with all the services that you're using and do lots of things. A lot of bots, or a lot of people tend to think of bots as being like customer service based, which is great. And we have a lot of traction in that area. But one thing that I think Botpress really excels at is taking a bot and making it do more things than just answer questions. It can answer questions really well, but what if it could also do X, Y, and Z at the same time? So that's kind of, if you're a fan of like AI agents or things like that, the AI workforce, it's empowering your bots or augmenting your bots to take actions based on things happening outside of a conversation. In other words, maybe providing in a conversational experience things that are outside the scope of the conversation. Okay. Now you might be saying to yourself, okay, but let's see, like, what's a real example of this? What's a practical use case for this? Or I want to see this in action, not with Postman, which is a tool that is dedicated to testing APIs, but instead, what if I'm using something like Dropbox? So now let me walk you through what I want to do on the Dropbox side of things. So the Dropbox version of this example. I, as the Dropbox file owner, let's say, I want to be notified every time a file is uploaded to my Dropbox. So in other words, let's say it's a collaborative folder. I share it with a couple of other people. Maybe I'm a teacher and my students upload their essays there, and I want to get notified every time. I want my bot to notify me, or I want my bot to take an action, for example. What I want is every time somebody uploads a file to this Dropbox, my bot can tell, of course, that's an action taken in a third-party service, so my webhook is triggered, and then my bot will take an action. Philosophically, or theoretically in the abstract, what you can do with this type of thing is, like, your bot receives the file, maybe it'll summarize it for you, and then maybe it can email you a small summary of what file has been uploaded. That's just one example. All that we're going to do today is confirm that a file has been uploaded, but I'm really encouraging you to use services like this or use these functionalities to expand the range of what your bot can do. Now, you might be asking yourself, how does my bot know that something has happened in Dropbox? Or at least that's the way that I phrased this question to myself. So in other words, if I upload a file here, how do I get this bot to know that something has happened here? Well, that's where what I mentioned earlier, the tool if this then that comes in. This is just a really simple automation tool. The example that I'm using today is going to be paid, but there are services out there that will allow you to make HTTP requests or post requests in a way that is not paid. So that's up to you depending on what service you're comfortable using, so on and so forth. Peppermint tea today is really lovely. It's nice and rainy here. Okay, so you'll see I've very creatively named this file, or this applet as IFTTT calls it. If new file in your folder, then make a web request. And that's what I want to happen. But you might be asking yourself, Robert, what the heck does that mean? And I'll show you. So let me show you how I set up this Dropbox applet. The first thing I did was I connected my IFTTT account to Dropbox. So if every time there's a new file in my folder, then make a web request. Let's talk about this web request for just a sec. You'll notice this is quite similar, albeit like it looks very different, but the work that we're about to do is quite similar to what we did in Postman earlier. In a way, this method is actually simpler because the UI is so streamlined, but of course it's the same work just for different audiences. It's asking me for a URL. Of course, it's looking for that webhook URL from earlier. I've already pasted it, but we'll do it again just for posterity's sake. And it's going to be that same one that we pasted into our webhook, our Postman over here. So it's that same webhook URL. Method is post because I'm sending information, I'm posting information. I'm putting information in the post, I'm mailing a letter. Content type, we don't have to select it, but in theory, this would just be text. And then the real meat and potatoes is this body section. So this is going to be the same as what we have over here. Remember earlier we pasted our conversation ID? We'll have to do the same thing again here. Now, in life, you might not always have the conversation ID, but this is just for an example purpose. It's just to give you a proof of concept so you can understand what the functionality is. So let's get our conversation ID over here. Let's copy and paste it. We'll replace this one with this one, but otherwise the code looks exactly the same. And I'll just hit update action. We'll save it. My applet has been updated. And then we go over here. All right. You'll see that I ran this one time. That's when I was testing this earlier. Okay, so let's return back to our bot and just make sure that all of this is still going to function the same. So we see our conversation ID. That's all the same. We see our webhook event is going to be triggered. Remember, we just put in that URL. So in theory, every time that something is happening in Dropbox, this should be triggered. These all look the same. So I think we could just go ahead and give it a shot. Let's navigate back to our Dropbox and I'll upload a simple file, maybe just the image for today's stream. And we'll give it a wait. So file has been uploaded. And so now remember the expected behavior is that all of this stuff behind the scenes will trigger and end up in a message being sent here. So we'll wait a while and we'll see how this goes. Now this, well, everybody settle in for just a second because there's a lot of magic's going to be happening behind the scenes. So we can just, play some Jeopardy music, sit back in your chairs, ask how your day's been. Mine's been great. Let's remind ourselves of what's happening behind the scenes. So here, we'll navigate back to our thing. We'll go to settings. If new file in your folder, this being the new file in said folder, then make a web request to our bot. And that web request is going to trigger sending that message. I don't want to notify me when anything is running, so I'll let that happen. I don't believe the audio from my computer is coming through, but the message was just sent. So let's go back to our bot's conversation. We see here the webhook has been received. So in other words, let's remind ourselves again of what happened. So I uploaded a file in Dropbox. In other words, I took an action in a third-party service, and I sent I took an action in a third-party service, and then my bot somehow has access to that information. My bot knows that an action has been taken in a third-party service. Now that's, I hope, maybe igniting in you some ideas about how you can use webhooks and Botpress to your business's advantage or to your personal project's advantage. In other words, webhooks are a really simple way of really not writing any code, but giving your bot or augmenting the capabilities of your bot such that it can do some more interesting things. So in other words, your webhooks are a really good way to dip your toe in the water of connecting your bot to third-party services or things happening elsewhere in the world or things that exist outside the scope of a conversation. Maybe the last thing I want to show you before I dive into today's new feature and then we part ways for the day is I want to show you all of the stuff that's happening behind the scenes in the logs of my bot in case I don't have access to the conversation or maybe this is happening multiple times, but I want to see the logs. So I'll navigate over to my logs and there are two things I want to show you. The first is we see event of type webhook received. So that's my bot is telling me this. And then we see the log card. So remember that card that we set up earlier over here, this one called webhook received. it's printing that information to our logs over here in the log card. So we see webhook received, but of course you can write whatever you like here, depending on whatever's useful for you. And the level is info. So the idea here is like, this is just for you to know that this thing is happening correctly. Of course, we didn't need that because the message is being sent here. But in a real world setting, you won't have access to this message, or you won't see it except in the conversation history. So you are able to take a look at your logs over here. So I do encourage you, I suppose maybe like an aside or a small other takeaway, additional takeaway from today's stream is that do use the log card, because you'll find that it's really helpful at keeping track of what your bot is doing. You might say, Robert, I don't need that today. And maybe you don't need it today, but there will come a time as your bots get more powerful and they're doing more things that you're going to want really clear visibility into what your bot is doing and when it's doing it. So that's my little spiel for the log card. Thank you for listening. And then just for the last couple of minutes for today's conversation, I want to show off a new feature for today. Off the top, though, I will say I'm going to wrap up right after I show off this feature. I'm going to wrap up today's live stream. So if you've got any questions about building bots or Botpress or really anything you want to ask, please go ahead and speak now or forever hold your bot building peace. But the thing I want to show off for today is we've completely revamped analytics in Botpress. So Chris is not here, but shout out to Chris for rebuilding this dashboard. He is the person that built Dashboard 2.0, and he also completely revamped the way that you interact with analytics in Botpress. There are two key things I want to take away from this complete revamp. The first is, holy crap, so much more useful, relevant information and information that I actually want to see, and laid out in a much clearer way. So the way that this looks and the way you interact with this is fantastic. The second thing is, if you're a team or if you're a business or if you're a company using Botpress as an integral part of your organization, you need access to things like custom time periods, maybe custom dashboards, etc. And so if you are a team plan subscriber on Botpress, you have access to maybe saving multiple views, depending on who's collaborating, looking at specific time periods for your data, sources of data, etc. So a really exciting feature for teams that are using Botpress. Again, Chris, if you're watching the recording of this later on, hella nice job. This thing is beautiful. And of course, probably with the custom analytics, there's one thing that I cannot not mention, or I must mention, is that if you are a team plan subscriber or you are a team using Botpress, the analytics you have access to, I call them custom analytics, not because you can customize this dashboard, or of course you can save more than one default view, but because you'll actually be able to add specific analytics or things that your bot is measuring directly in the studio. So in other words, you'll be able to see here, you can add, for example, a card saying keep track of X action or X thing being done, and then you'll have access to it over here. I'll put out a more detailed video and documentation for this later on in a sec. So in other words, if you're interested in this feature or if this is something that you might find useful, you might keep an eye out for that. But this was released under 24 hours ago, so you're all getting that good before everyone else gets it, of course. Matt, if you're having problems with response speed, you might find it useful to swap over to 3.5. Our response speed is pretty similar to 4, although the thing that clients usually ask is responses are streamed in GPT-4 as opposed to sent in one chunk in Botpress. But if speed is your main concern, you might find it useful to swap over to exclusively 3.5. If you're wondering about what the heck I just said, in the knowledge agent, as your bot is making kind of your knowledge queries, you can swap your model strategy over to fastest, and your bot will always use 3.5, which is of course much faster than GPT-4, and of course probably worth mentioning here that it's cheaper as well. You have already. In that case, I would say its response speed is not something that we're currently actively working on. But if you're finding that it's coming up over again, please. That's what the feature requests channel is for. But it's something that we do keep under consideration. So that's webhooks. I will say when I began today, I wasn't sure. What what I was going to show off for webhooks. But I think actually the concept of taking action in a bot based on things that are happening in a third-party service is a great way maybe to conceptualize this. Matt, I would be curious to know, like, are there other services out there that behave differently, performing the same task? And if so, I would like to see maybe some comparisons. That's always helpful. All right. I'm going to wrap up today's live stream today because I think we went through a pretty juicy example testing webhooks. I encourage you to maybe test out webhooks yourself. If you're curious about this setup or you want to know more, feel free to ping me on the channel, or if you want an export of this template, I would be happy to share that with you. Otherwise, thank you for dropping by today's live stream, or indeed watching the recording later on YouTube. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your weeks, and I will see you either at Patrick's stream on Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern, or of course at this stream again next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you later. Happy bot building, everyone. Bye-bye.